thank you very much to those of you who are filtering into the session this evening. My name is Mark Johnson. I'm a legal and policy officer at Big Brother Watch, and this is an exclusive webinar for our supporters, who are always incredibly grateful for your very generous support. And this evening we're going to be talking about a bill which has very, very serious ramifications for both freedom of expression and also the right to privacy, which is the Online Safety Bill. I think it's without doubt that this bill is probably one of the most significant bills that's going through Parliament at the moment, amongst the myriad of bills that are making their way through both houses, and also probably one of the most chilling, not least when it comes to freedom of speech. To give you a quick bit of background on the bill before we get into the discussion, what this legislation is essentially going to do is outsourcing online policing to tech companies themselves, and it's going to make tech executives in Silicon Valley our new privatized online police, both in terms of dealing with online content that's deemed to be illegal, which they will have to make judgments on. And while that might be quite clear and obvious in some cases, in other cases you can imagine that they're not the best placed people to make judgments of those kind. But also where the bill goes even further, and it talks about lawful online speech, which is deemed to be harmful. So plenty to unpackage there. If that wasn't enough, there are also provisions in this bill which include ISP blocking, undermining online anonymity, scanning private messages, and it even creates a new offence which criminalises speech, which is deemed to be seriously distressing. To help me navigate our way through things this evening, I'm really excited to be joined by Baroness Claire Fox, who is the Director of the Academy of Ideas, a former MEP, long-standing campaigner on free speech, and now also a member of the House of Lords. So Claire, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Really appreciate it.
It's good to be here.
So I guess where I want to start off really before we get into a discussion about the bill was maybe to talk a bit about the background to what we're considering here, which is really a backdrop of increased big tech censorship. There have been a number of really high-profile cases over the last couple of years. You don't need to think too hard for them to come to mind, whether it be examples which engage geopolitics, presidential elections, but also even closer to home with instances like the talk radio channel being taken down from YouTube, or even Big Brother Watch's own video of David Davis speaking on the topic of vaccine passports being taken down. And so what I was going to ask you was, why do you think we're seeing this rise in big tech censorship at the moment? Do you think that it's partly ideological and due to the kind of revolving door between Silicon Valley and Washington and the kind of political establishment there? Or do you think that it is motivated by the threat of regulation of this kind coming down the track, and companies are looking to preserve their reputations? What do you think that it stems from, and also how concerning is this legislation in that context?
So I think initially it did start off as a response, a defensive response against regulation, that the companies themselves were constantly being told by whichever government or transnational organizations that they had to do more. And so we've seen this a lot with multinationals in a whole range of areas around, particularly nanny state type things, that they panic. So, you'll get alcohol companies that are more anti-alcohol than a Puritan, because they want to be seen to be not encouraging people to drink too much. We've seen that as a constant. So there was a sense in which the kind of notion of the internet, the online world being a wild west, was something that was boasted about. But when obviously some of the more negative aspects, and there are obviously negative aspects to it, as anyone who's been on the receiving end of a pylon will testify, people then start thinking, well, the big tech start thinking, well, if we could be seen to be doing something, then that's fine. I think it's developed its own ideological raison d'etre because the online world has become so much of the public square. And that really came to a head during COVID and lockdown periods when there was no public square. I mean, that itself was, the physical public square was abolished. But anyway, you got a kind of sense that a democratizing wave, the kind of populism that we saw maybe associated with 2016 Brexit in the UK, Trump being voted in, that kind of sense of ordinary people not going along with the establishment's desired outcomes, really sort of expressed itself in the online world. People were organizing their, I mean, there was obviously the Arab Spring, which was greeted very positively, but quickly that turned into, but what happens if ordinary people could speak for themselves and organize, and, you know, they might make the wrong decisions. And I think at that point, the leadership of big tech companies felt that they had a role to play in shaping some of that politically. They shared some of the concerns about the Wild West democratic impulses of people saying what they thought, and it being dangerous. I think they bought into it. And often their political instincts are more akin with the politicians than they are with the users of their services.
That example of the Arab Spring is a brilliant one, because we went through a kind of golden age of the internet as a kind of open forum, a place where people could mobilize and exchange ideas freely. And perhaps it's a cynical analysis, but as once upon a time, I imagine, you know, it would have been the case that politicians and the conventional media were effectively the gatekeepers of speech. I mean, they would have had a monopoly on speech once upon a time. And the internet has had this brilliant democratizing effect of speech. It's created a marketplace of ideas. Do you think, for want of a better term, that maybe this is an attempt on the part of politicians to kind of take back control of control of speech? As I said, you know, there would have been a monopoly once upon a time of politicians and newspapers basically commanding a discourse which made it out to the public. Examples like the Arab Spring, which demonstrate the kind of democratizing effect of the internet, show that actually it can be a tool to allow everybody to take speech into their own hands. But do you think that the regulation of this kind is maybe a kickback to that, and concerns that actually politicians don't have control over speech, for better or for worse, and that actually it's more in the hands of the people than ever before?
Yeah, I think it's undoubtedly the case that there was a recognition that the gatekeeping role of responsible people who could be trusted to tell the right stories and deliver the right narrative had lost control. Because if you've got a phone in your pocket, you know, you've basically got a publishing house. I mean, anyone can publish anything, and that is both exciting and exhilarating, but it's quite scary. And if we're honest, it's scary for all of us. You know, it's not just it's not, I mean, freedom is always a bit scary. It's always a bit edgy, you know, like if it's controlled by kind of the good people, in inverted commas, then you can all feel very safe. But once anyone can say anything, then it can be frustrating if they're saying things you don't like. So I think there's no doubt about it. It's that democratizing impulse which has led to the panic. And I think the form that takes in relation to this bill, but in terms of a broader discussion, by the way, is misinformation. So the phrases that they use, there's two ways of looking at this bill. So I'll deal with misinformation now, because I think that's where the gatekeepers are, and then there's the harm safety issue, which is slightly separate.
Yeah.
The misinformation part is where the idea is that the mob, the masses of people, are now exposed to a wide range of information which is not checked by fact checkers or by people who really know. And that, if you're trying to run society and control things, is quite a scary prospect, because it means that, and I mean, just to use an example, I remember when I think it was the Checkers report came out, I think that's what it was called, on Brexit, and there was a kind of press release, and Michael Gove, various people said, we've done a deal. It was all about doing a deal. Anyway, we've done a deal, blah, blah. And what happened was, within about an hour, I was looking on Twitter, and basically ordinary Brexiteers had read the report and were going through it line by line, correcting what the government said and publishing it. And then people with bigger accounts were republishing these kind of slightly nerdy takedowns of the government. And suddenly they didn't have control of the information, you know, like they'd said it was one thing and everyone else was going, no, it's not. But you would have normally said that in the pub. Now you could say it to anyone online. And so consequently, misinformation is a big thing. And or what they brand as misinformation, it's that ability to counter official information. And I think that we saw so much of that. If you, the examples you gave, that was big tech before they were mandated to do so, basically deciding what the narrative, what the facts were on COVID and how it was dealt with, and taking away or censoring anything that went against those, as they understood it, the factual analysis. And we see it in relation to a range of issues, and we're in the middle of a war, and you can't get more, you can't, at the moment, you can tell that there's, on the one hand, there should be an Arab Spring optimism by saying at least some people in Russia can get true information, at least people in the Ukraine can have access to information, and they're not just cut off, or they're not just, you know, in Russia, you're not just dependent on state TV. They should be saying that. But actually, the obsession in the West is to stop misinformation, fake news being spread online. So that's their concerns all the time.
And this really speaks to the heart of our concerns, I guess, which is very much this legal but harmful provision, and the categorization of free speech, which could be deemed as harmful. And as you say, it's been a kind of long-standing aim of the government to include this information. They've certainly mentioned it in all of their comms around this bill, and it's something that we're pretty worried about. The Labour Party also talking quite extensively about trying to add it in. I mean, if platforms are going to have to fortify their terms of use, and then they're going to be compelled to uphold them, we're going to see more examples like the David Davis, the talk radio, right? We're going to see more of that in the future. And I mean, how concerned are you about that?
Oh, totally. I mean, the thing that's really peculiar is that partly popular support for this bill might have emerged in relation to big tech having too much power. And if you listen to politicians, they say this is about curtailing big tech's power. But actually, it's going to give big tech an enormous amount of power by forcing them to act, even if they want to be more liberal, even if they think, well, actually, it's all right, let it pass. Now they're going to be under pressure to say, remove that material just in case the government fine us for putting it up. So it endorses the censorious nature of what's already big tech's attempts at policing the content of the online world. So that's why it's very dangerous. And I would imagine that we're going to see a very sanitized online space in many regards if this bill gets through, which it will, because there is no opposition. And obviously I want to say to Big Brother Watch, and you know, you've got a real job in your hands. Obviously you can change the discussion, and we all should. That's what we've got to aim to do. But whereas with the protest parts of the police and crime bill, there was some squeamishness on the Labour Party, and they opposed that. I mean, a bit half-heartedly in some instances, but that's not the point. If the Labour Party are actually much more enthusiastic about the online safety bill, the Lib Dems are a bit split on it for different reasons, and so there's not very much opposition at all. So we've really got to build a movement, and there is time, because it's going to take time before it goes through both houses, as it were. The other thing I wanted to say was that, you know, like I see you've got the sign behind of stop facial recognition, and there was just a small question in the Lords this morning or this afternoon, which I just kind of sputteringly spoke on at the end. But, you know, quite a few people were actually, you know, really pushing the government on it, because it's quite a scary set of guidance that's come out from the College of Policing. And, you know, the minister just kind of stood there, you know, it's quite brazen really, and says, oh no, it's not going to do that. This guidance is very clear that it's only meant for these people, and so on and so forth. And if you want, that's the way politics has been conducted. And again, the Labour Party are a bit unsure about this facial recognition. They didn't really push it. It was more the Lib Dems and a few independents like me. But what you then have got to say is, you got your social media out. I got my social media out. People then start saying, I haven't heard about this facial recognition technology before. Oh my God, I didn't know about that. And so if you're the government, you're furious, aren't you? Because it's all kind of getting out there. And now the government are going to, as you said in your introduction, get big tech to do their dirty work, because they're going to basically say there are certain things that should not be allowed to misinform the public. And misinform means go against a particular narrative. Can I just start talking about harmful a bit now? Because I think where we're going to lose this argument with a lot of people, or rather where we have to be much better at this argument so that we can win over people, is that people do find the online world difficult to negotiate. It's full of trolls. It can be very nasty. There's a particular worry about children and you know, things like suicide sites, bullying online. You know, it is true that, you know, everything from, you know, you send a picture to your boyfriend and then it's kind of shared around, it becomes sort of mass pornography, sexting, all these things that are new in the contemporary world. You know, there's a different kind of vibe. And then there's this idea that women are particularly harassed online, and particularly any woman in the public sphere. And it doesn't matter what side of an argument you're on. You know, you can say J.K. Rowling is just like constantly hassled and viciously assaulted verbally online. So what's happened is they've emphasized safety and harm. And that's, I think, because already the arguments have been eaten away at in terms of free speech. And the dangers of free speech, which is why at university campuses, the form that censorship takes is safe spaces. You know, it's all about safety, protection from people hearing things which will cause them to be triggered or to upset. I'm not being gratuitous when I say upset. People will say it causes trauma if I hear that argument. We've had a physical manifestation of loose words cost lives during COVID, which is the idea that if you say the wrong thing, people might not take the vaccine and it might lead to death. The conspiracy mongering amongst some people in relation to the lockdown measures meant that people didn't take precautions and died as a consequence. We're now in a war in which we can see, or most of us can see, that the propaganda wars do mean that there is fake news coming from all sides. But you know, it was particularly concerned, as I am, about Russia's aggression. You know, I do get fed up people kind of saying, oh, but did you know this? And they've got it from some mad dark website, some kind of Russian apologism. But it doesn't even matter if you don't agree with me on the war. The point is, there's an information war, and this idea that it can cause harm in as much as if you actually put out information that's fake information about one side of a war, that can lead to more bombing. It can lead to the escalation of a conflict. So I think that where the government have kind of that we have to really counter is they say to people, we're only doing this to protect you. You know, it's to protect you. It's about safety, about ensuring that you're not exposed to vile pornography, horrible terrorism, you know, that kind of thing. And I think that for any free speecher, that's always a real challenge, because it means you sometimes have to defend the most gross things, or, you know, potentially. But
I think that speaks to kind of a broader point, which is almost like that this bill almost acknowledges some kind of state failure, which is that the government have kind of conceded the police don't have enough resource to deal with some of the terrible things that we all agree need to come offline, and actually that they actually just want to pass the buck onto these companies to deal with that. And you know, in many cases that nobody will have objections to some of the things that you mentioned being taken down. Absolutely. I guess where it becomes really problematic is where we're talking about lawful expression and actually targeting free speech, because as you mentioned, there's this new developing notion that free speech could actually be in some way harmful, but also the breadth of some of the definitions. And that was, I was actually just going to move on just to another point which I was going to ask you about, which is we previously in the last bill, there was a kind of, for those people that are not too familiar with it, there was a draft, which was a kind of blueprint. It kind of set out what the government wanted to do with this bill. Now we have the full bill, and we're expecting it in Parliament for the first time in a couple of weeks. And where we talking specifically about this legal but harmful concept, what was set out in the draft was a kind of a broad definition of harm. It was very loose. And when it comes to things like freedom of expression, that's really the last thing that you need. Now, the government have kind of moved away from that notion of defining it in a way in the bill. And now we have a new challenge, which is very much that the Secretary of State in DCMS, the department which will be sponsoring this bill, they will get to decide what is harmful, what legal speech is harmful. I mean, how dangerous is that? Particularly, I mean, we've seen this throughout the course of the pandemic, the government using this very kind of sneaky secondary legislation, as it's called, and it gets very minimal scrutiny in Parliament. I mean, how concerned are you about that element? The idea that basically a single government minister could decide almost on a whim with very little scrutiny and say, this kind of speech is harmful. I know it's legal, by the way, but this is harmful. I mean, how concerned are you about that?
Yeah, very, because obviously what they said was, oh, we've listened to your concerns. You think that harmful but legal but harmful is too nebulous and too vague, too open to subjective interpretation. So we'll help you out. We'll pass the bill and then we'll tell you what's harmful. Actually, even if you look at the list that Priti Patel wrote an article mentioning, actually it still was nebulous, subjective and vague, because it was things that are obviously harmful, like bullying, like harassment. And we all know that, I mean, it's like hate. And, hate
goes back to the definitions again.
It's the whole sort of and of course, one of the problems is you can't define these things, right? I mean, it's very different. So what should have been a very targeted bill, I mean, you could say, for example, that you might have an argument about it, but the government could say, at the moment, suicide sites that tell people how to commit suicide are legal, right? We will make them illegal, right? We will more closely police, as you said, what is already illegal, but where there's some loopholes in relation to pornography or child pornography, particularly. We'll get rid of that, right? And that would be entirely appropriate, right? That would, you could understand that. It's already illegal, but in cases of where it can slip through. In other words, they could have really tightly targeted, children having access to adult pornography that's violent, legal, but you don't want your kids watching it. We could work out ways about access, but they haven't done that. They've thrown the kitchen sink at this bill. And they've literally come up with a list of harms that can happen online. Everything you ever thought of are thrown in there. And now the Secretary of State will have the opportunity, without any parliamentary oversight, and it shouldn't just be parliamentary, but secondary legislation just means that, as you rightly pointed out, it barely gets voted on. I mean, the laws don't get it at all, really just nod it through. Not that we're very important, but because we're anti-democratic anyway. But but the Commons don't get it. The elected representatives of the people don't get it. But the main thing is that it's always an afterthought. It's not given any kind of time at all, and it can change all the time. And you're absolutely right. People who didn't know anything about legislation found out during COVID that they could just bring in a piece of secondary legislation. People say, will it be debated? You say, no, it's happening tomorrow. I mean, it was just like it's coming through at rate of knots. It's incredibly dangerous to give that power to government ministers. But I think the broader problem we've got is that people do not know what this bill's about. When I ask people, they'll say, well, I think it's terrible the way that, and it depends on their favorite person. I think it's terrible the way that gender critical feminists are harassed online, or the way that trans activists are harassed online. So it could be either side, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's terrible that there's racist abuse thrown at footballers, or I think it's terrible that there's the people who are critical of critical race theory are harassed online. They're going to tally that up, or they talk about children, or things like that. And there's not a wide enough discussion about what's really going to happen. Now, you don't have to use hyperbole. You don't have to keep saying the words authoritarian. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think it's in the sense they don't think of themselves as censors. And it's also important to note that they've made, and this is an argument that I have with free speechers. Free speechers think that you can enhance the duty to free speech in the bill and that will protect us. I personally think this is a waste of time. It gives legitimacy to the legislation as well. And it also makes free speech kind of like only in these circumstances. And they've already done a bit of this on freedom of the press, which they say is protected, and on misinformation. We don't mean you journalists, you're all right, we'll look after you. We don't mean to stop people sharing. During election times, you can say anything you want about politicians, but it's so limited, and it's micromanaging what should be freedom. The freedom to not speak, by the way, but to hear multitude of opinions, because free speech is often confused with somebody like me saying, I want the right to speak, or anyone else saying, I want the right to speak. But actually, in a democracy, what's more important about free speech is the right to listen, to be able to hear a multitude of voices. I don't know enough about Eastern European politics. I don't know enough about the geopolitical situation historically. I want to be able to watch films from different quarters. I want to be able to listen to different opinions. I want to be able to work out myself what I think the balance is in relation to what I'm hearing. I don't want a big tech company or a Secretary of State deciding that I shouldn't have access to that material because it would be harmful for me or it would misinform me, because that takes away my ability and my agency to make up my own mind about what I think.
I completely agree. I heard a fantastic quote recently, which was about freedom of expression and censorship, and it was that censorship doesn't tell you what's right or wrong; it just tells you who has power and who doesn't. And I completely agree. Now we're gonna have a look at some questions that are coming through in just a second. Just while I have a look at some of the questions that are coming through, I was also going to ask you, just to circle back to that point that you made previously about, well, we've spoken about it at good length about misinformation. I mean, one of the examples that we did see during the course of the pandemic was the fact that journalists, very mainstream journalists as well, started to explore this notion that and as with all discussions on free speech, I'll cast no judgment on the actual topic, only that I think that people should say it. But journalists started to explore this possibility that the pandemic may have been a spillover from a lab in China, and then of course we saw Facebook and other platforms start to suppress and censor, only then to change their mind once the White House and the authorities had opened up that possibility as a line of inquiry. And what I was going to ask you was how problematic is this idea that we have to, and it's one of these things, nobody wants misinformation and disinformation online, but how problematic is that if we start to censor content that's described as such, when it comes to that kind of epistemic process, the idea of that knowledge could move, and actually it's better to shine a light on things. The idea that sunshine is the best disinfectant. If somebody is willfully lying, it's best that we pour cold water on it by calling it out rather than shutting it down, because actually one person's misinformation with the lab leak theory, which we still don't really know the answer to, but one person's misinformation or disinformation could actually later become something that we know to be fact. So how dangerous is that approach to the kind of epistemic process and the development of knowledge?
Absolutely. I mean, this is probably the thing that frightens me most. I mean, the Wuhan lab leak example is a very good one, because we actually have subsequently seen through leaks emails amongst leading scientists, including shockingly, the person who runs the Wellcome Trust, which is one of the greatest biomedical. I mean, I'm a great fan of the Wellcome Trust, fantastic biomedical charity. But when Jeremy Farrar is saying, well, yes, there might well be some validity to this leak, but we don't want it to come out because we don't want to discredit science, or we don't want that. And the consequence of that, by the way, is that you were saying we'll probably never know whether there was a leak from the Wuhan lab. But one of the reasons why we might never know is because nobody was able to investigate it, because the investigation was put on ice, because anyone who wanted to ask questions, in journalistic or any other kind of questions, was shut down. And so serious investigative journalism was prohibited in that instance by a delegitimization process, which is what misinformation does. It delegitimizes. It kind of gives you a label of being irresponsible, being an irresponsible liar. Now, the difficulty we've got is that there is, though, probably something of an epistemological crisis at the moment about truth. And one of the things that's concerning me in a different guise, but I suppose it raises the problem, is that, you know, because people have become so cynical and distrustful of mainstream media, of politicians during the last 2 years, maybe if that was your exposure to recognizing that they were not to be trusted in terms of politicians, for some people that was quite a radicalizing experience. There are other people that started around Brexit because they were so shocked, they were just kind of ordinary. They trusted the government, you know, we voted, they'll do it. And then they suddenly thought, oh my God, they haven't done it. They're trying to sell it. They're trying to betray the what's happening there? And then they were, as it were, you know, delegitimized by being called all sorts of names, and all this was going on. Things were happening behind the scenes. The consequence of that is that there's a crisis of trust. And it's a very legitimate crisis of trust. But the danger with it is that some perfectly fine people, you know, if you know the BBC says black, they think it must be white, which is just not true. That's not true, actually. Is you become nihilistically cynical, and you sort of, you can't, and it's almost like a kind of alternative populist version of and I'm a populist, by the way, an alternative populist version of postmodernism, which is there's no such thing as truth. Well, there is such a thing as truth. You know, some of the war films we're seeing will be faked, and some of them won't be. You know, there is a war going on in Ukraine. COVID was a real virus, but it's got to a point where people kind of reject everything. So the reason I'm mentioning that, I mean, people may or disagree or not agree with me, but I think there's a mood in which that degree of cynicism fuels the establishment's determination to use this online safety bill. That's what I'm more saying, because that they can, you know, and it will make people who are free speakers more nervous and anxious, because they can't believe how much rejection there is of views that are actually should be accepted as good coin. Now, I don't mean mindlessly, and you're absolutely right. You see, how do you deal with the problem of truth? You deal with it by having it in the public square. You know, you basically allow people to come up with crackpot theories, because there might not be crackpot theories, but through the course of an open debate, you work out what's the crackpot theory versus, you know, some of it's common sense, some of it's like there's no evidence, just making it up. And I've seen that video and it's rubbish. And people generally, whereas if somebody else makes that decision, we're in real trouble. But because of that crisis of truth, that again has given some fuel to the government's drive against misinformation. I'm very worried about that.
And I think that's exactly why we have to address that crisis in trust, don't we? Because that, as you say, that is often the source of some of the problems that we do see online. I mean, we also have at Big Brother Watch, you know, legitimate concerns about the amount of data collection that these platforms are doing, because you will hear it addressed in the course of the debate about this, you know, about the online safety bill, that it's the platforms, you know, algorithms creating a feedback loop. Now, I almost don't disagree with that, but what I think is the most important thing is not to then censor and suppress, but actually go right back to the start, look at the business models and say, hold on a second, maybe what we need to look at is the amount that they're of surveillance capitalism that is out there, and they're collecting so much data on us, and then that feedback loop is coming because they're basically spying on everything that we do while we're on their sites. I will stop ranting. I was going to go into some of the questions that we have. We have some really good ones that have come in. Do you think that the online safety bill is actually workable? What will be left of the internet if this bill passes? Just as a kind of addition to that, I think it's fascinating, this idea that we could inadvertently create a kind of like Great British firewall if we got this really badly wrong, and the direction that we're heading in. And you know, the idea that, you know, how could we apply some of these rules, this idea of, you know, harmful speech if I see a tweet from America, or what happens if we set up this regulatory system and it's all, you know, overseen by Ofcom here in the UK, but then somebody tweets me from Poland, where their government's been talking about a bill where if platforms take stuff down where it goes past Polish law, then the platform could be sanctioned there. I mean, could we just end up with like a kind of Great British firewall? And is that the danger, that we actually could just shut down a free and open internet if we're not careful?
I think that everybody's worried about this. this is obviously an international concern. And
Mhm.
so in some ways, one of the things that I've tried to argue recently because of the war is to say, look, what's happened in Russia? They've closed down the internet.
Yeah.
Why have they closed down the internet? Because they don't want anyone to know anything, right? And you know, when you sort of make that point, well, are you suggesting we do the same? And you know, Russia, by the way, and China, they don't come out and say we're censoring the internet. They say we're removing misinformation and fake news. They say we're removing information that will be harmful. I mean, none of them, no authoritarian has ever wandered around going, I enjoy censoring people. That's not what they do. They do it in a paternalistic, we're doing it in the best interest of it, etc. So you can kind of draw those analogies. Whether it's going to work, I mean, the degrees of incompetence in the British state are so severe that, you know, their ability to mess this up in terms of a practical outcome is quite considerable. And I think we all were very worried about GDPR, but the threat was much worse than the reality, even though it was a complete pain in the neck, the whole GDPR stuff. But all I'm saying is small charities will not find millions of pounds, you know, and all that sort of thing. But what did happen was it changed behavior. And so the danger is in the level of speech is that will lead to more self-censorship, and it will lead to a more risk-averse online world. But, you know, things are interesting. Elon Musk buying so much of Twitter, using a free speech. What's that about? But it's interesting, right? It is interesting. I don't know what the impact will be on, you know, because all these new platforms like, well, first of all, was Parler, Getter. Getter's got more promise, I think, possibly, but it's still nonetheless an echo chamber, which is why most of us, you know, I don't mind being on Getter, but I mean, I want to be on the public square. I don't want to be in a ghetto, not the ghetto. You know, I want to be in the middle of it all. And I don't want also to close down I change my mind on things all the time, you know, and I need to be open. So what I think, I don't think it's the end of the online world, but I think that the online world will end up having to adapt. We'll end up adapting in order to be able to carry on, because we've all got the habit now of having this publishing. And, you know, people don't like it when they're told, you know, people who get kicked off Twitter, you know, so, I mean, I don't use it, but the number of people who are on Telegram, I mean, there's all these different channels. And it's almost like every time they try and close something down. And finally, when I first went to China, first time I went, you know, I was kind of naive. You know, I kind of like, I suddenly realized I couldn't Google, you know, basically. And I thought, oh, I'm Western, how couldn't I Google? But anyway, I was writing an article and I suddenly realized I couldn't do the research because I was naive. I then talked to some students and they said, oh, it's all right, what you have to do is this. They just told me how to get it, right? So all these Chinese students, they were saying, oh yeah, that's censored, but what you need to do. So they were tech savvy and they had ways of finding out. I mean, they were all watching Netflix. There was quite a lot of that going on. So if you want to know, you could actually know. Now I think there'll be quite a lot of adaptation that goes on. None of this should make us complacent because that's all technical. The overall message of the online safety bill is that Ofcom, a regulator, will decide what you get to see and hear. Big tech is going to be empowered to police your speech on the basis of looking after you, and that will lead to you getting less access to less information, and your ability to say what you think will be curtailed because you'll forever be watching yourself so that you're not kicked out of the public square.
That's a really good point. I'm just going to now, Claire, I'm just going to try and rattle through as many of these questions as I can.
Sorry,
Brilliant. Yeah, so what else do we have here? How much sway will the government of the day have under the bill? Can they change the definition of things like misinformation and get it taken down? Then the next government could change it again. I'm going to couple that up with another question that's coming, which is who determines what's harmful, what are the criteria, what means of redress will there be to remediate incorrect decisions. I'll start that off and then we can talk a bit about like what that might mean. I mean, in essence, I mentioned at the start, what the kind of blueprint originally had was a broad definition of harm. The government have almost moved away from that entirely now. There is a definition of harm in the new bill. It's something like content which could cause an appreciable level of physical or psychological harm to a large number of adults or something like that. It's almost a negligible, particularly talking about psychological harm that doesn't reach a kind of clinical threshold. You're then talking about quite a negligible definition. But I think the most concerning thing here, and we spoke about it a bit before, is the fact that actually the Secretary of State really will just be able to define themselves, what is and isn't harmful speech. And I guess that is a minefield, isn't it? In as much as we could have a Secretary of State that actually decides on quite a political level, I'm not sure I like this video because it might encourage immigration, which we don't approve of, or I'm trying to think of a better example perhaps, but actually that's one of the problems here, is that the Secretary of State is going to have so much power, and that is a really flawed way to preside over the limitations of expression, which should really be adjudged by the full parliamentary process and scrutinised fully by Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on most of it. I mean, the point about definitions, they're hopeless. Yeah. So that's why there's no strict definition of hate speech, because it's one of those things. What does that mean? It's in the eye of the beholder. The European Union's definition, the UN's definition, the UK government's definition, and they all skirt around. Basically, it's just like whatever you think hate is. And you'll know that in hate speech legislation, it's basically as the victim perceives, and that's what it's going to be like, right? What's harmful as is perceived either by the victim, who says, I find that harmful, or somebody else saying, I think it will be harmful to you, or Ofcom deciding, and it's going to open up a minefield. And the psychological harm is very important, because that's what's changed in relation to harm and safety in recent years. Speech that led to physical, inciting someone and saying, I've got a gun, I'll meet you on the corner, go and kill Mrs. Smith, if you see what I mean. Yeah, we get it. That's words, speech. Yeah, you didn't do the shooting, but you orchestrated it, right? Even incitement at the level of kind of whipping up a crowd, which I disagree. Everyone's got agency; they can ignore the incitement. But this is much worse than that, because it basically is saying that it is not leading to violence in a direct way. This is basically psychological harm, and safety is no longer safety of your life, because it used to be. It's more comfort. It used to be, we want to keep you safe, so we don't want somebody to whip up the racist to go and beat you up. Now it's, we don't want those words to be heard by you, because that will cause you psychological harm. Psychological harm is then ill-defined. The categorization of mental health terminology and the pathologization of speech, which has been basically almost piloted in universities, will mean that anything and everything can be seen as psychologically harmful and causing trauma. The other thing that's going to happen is, I think somebody was asking about remediation. They are trying to, and this will be the kind of thing that we can imagine the opposition parties will try and water down in the bill. I mean, liberals, but I want to keep well away from it, which is to try and find as many ways that you can, as it were, if you get banned, that you can what's it called?
Seek a right of redress.
Seek a right to redress, and so on. But it's a process which you don't want, right? And you need to be able to think aloud and say the wrong thing occasionally. And this idea that you have to kind of manicure what you're saying in spin, so that should you have to go and ask for, why you've taken it down. The other thing it's going to lead to, I think, is politicized complaints. Yeah. I mean, you have events. Big Brother Watch has events. I've been at them before. Yeah. Not everyone on the panel you agree with. Sure. Not everyone in the audience says things that you might cringe occasionally at things people say. Now, at the Academy of Ideas that I run, that's our business, right? We put on big festivals. You have panels. Say somebody goes through our back catalogue and finds somebody saying something on climate change that seemed to be harmful, or something on suicide, or something on any number of topics. They will be able to go to Ofcom and say, have you seen this film? Because it's currently up. So it might be about 10 years ago, but it's part of our back catalogue. So you can imagine the amount of potentially malicious complaining that will go on. This is going to open the doors to a bureaucratic nightmare. Now, I think that as a consequence of that, there's going to be quite a lot of entanglements that make it almost impossible for them to be able to censor everything and anything that's coming through the door. But as I said, the biggest threat is of course that we all start watching our P's and Q's. And in terms of a democratic debate, once you do that, you're basically forcing speech into the private sphere and out of the public sphere in order to avoid surveillance. And we know that they want surveillance in the private sphere as well. But I just mean that you'll be like whispering under tables rather than being able to join in the public discussion.
I think we'll all be poorer for it if it did.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to we'll go for one more question, I think, which actually follows on from what you just said about this right to redress and right of appeal. Nadine Doré says that it protects free speech. Do you think that's true? I mean, it's quite a weak addition to the bill when actually most of the platforms already have redress mechanism. I guess the problem is that many of them are kind of not really that effective. There's certainly no transparency about it. And then if I just add this on a bit more to that question, I mean, you mentioned already the free speech protections. Again, they're pretty negligible. We're not going to get very far by beefing those up. What we need is to actually move away from this legal but harmful concept in general, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually worried about an over reliance on legislation rather than on politics or on civil society. I mean, maybe it's because I'm in a legislative chamber now, in the House of Lords. But my God, I mean, there's nothing that they can't think that you need a law against or for. It's like you can't move unless it's legalized or made criminal. I mean, depending on which way.
Sure.
And that's actually chokes up civil society, and it actually is a real attack on freedom. So it sounds sometimes appealing when somebody says, Dominic Raab says, we'll have a Bill of Rights and we'll put freedom of speech in there, so we'll all be all right. But I bet you, there'll be a million exceptions. And also, that's not sufficient, right? Because I don't believe him, because he's doing that at the same time they're bringing the online safety bill. Yeah. So it's a formal commitment to freedom of speech. But formal commitments to freedom of speech, if you're asking a big tech to get rid of lawful but harmful material, is not free speech, right? And it therefore makes free speech almost like a kind of slogan. It empties it of any content. It's a really technocratic approach. I also think that it's an attempt at buying off opponents, of course, but when you actually look, there's been a couple of things like that there's this attempt at bringing in academic freedom by bringing in an academic freedom bill. Yeah. As it happens, they might even have dumped that now, but they've certainly gone quiet on it. But one of the reasons for that is, once you try and legislate in terms of freedom, people will say, but what about in this instance? What about? And then you have to get into legislation or the exemptions and exceptions. It's a very narrow thing, and it causes, I think it causes complacency in challenging a culture that means that free speech is not safe on campus. You can't ban censorship effectively.
I completely agree. Claire, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant, fantastic discussion, and I'm sure we will have plenty more of them as this bill...
I think that we might have to exert our right to protest, and
I think we might.
Our right to free speech.
If that isn't all shut down between...
No, but I think we've got a silent protest. We're going to ban the noisy ones.
We might have to.
Just I suppose to say, there is a bit of time, because you are right that it'll, it's going to be the big thing in the Queen's speech. This one. They're going to really make a fuss about it. They'll bring it in as soon as possible, but it will drag on a bit.
Yeah.
And so I just think that after the Queen's speech on May the 10th, and it takes time for the legislative process to start. Yeah. I think we just got a busy summer, and I really want, I suppose your job is to get the word out, and I'll do whatever I can.
I'm looking forward to being in the trenches with you on that one. Yeah, no, right. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. If you haven't signed it already, we do have a petition, albeit I understand the limitations of petitions, but we want to try and demonstrate to the government how many people do care about this issue. So if you haven't signed it already, the petition, perhaps we can do a follow-up in a supporters email with a link to the petition, and it's basically calling for the government to drop the legal but harmful measure from the bill. It's got about 40,000 signatures so far, which is great, but we want 100,000. So if you haven't signed it already, please do. Claire, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining as well. Have a good evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.